Hello and welcome everybody, this is Roland from graphicinmotion.com and it is tutorial time again. So let's check out what we are going to create together today. In this 4-part tutorial series we are going to create particle trails in Houdini. I recently had the pleasure of creating some awesome motion graphics for a client's enormous LED wall. This experience inspired me to share some simple but valuable techniques to create motion graphics in Houdini. In part 1 of this tutorial series, I will guide you through creating a powerful particle trail setup, complete with customizable controls that can be utilized with any particle simulation. But that's just the beginning. In part 2, I will show you how to transform this setup into a Houdini digital asset, also called an HDA, so you can easily install and reuse it like any other Houdini node. But we are not stopping there. In part 3, we will bring this HDA to life, demonstrating its practical use as we create the dynamic scene that you saw in the introduction video. And finally, in part 4, I will teach you how to render your masterpiece using the powerful Redshift render engine in Houdini. If you want to grab the project file and the HDA, they are available for download on Patreon. A link is in the video description. And now, without further ado, let's jump right into the tutorial. Okay, now let's get started. And as always, we create a geometry node at first. And this will be my particle trails basic setup. So let's name it and let's dive inside. And first of all, I want to create an emitter for my particles and I will use a circle for that. So let's create a circle. We can use a primitive to do that. And I just want to lay it flat in the scene on ZX for now. And I want to make it a little bit smaller. So let's just make it a tiny bit smaller, like so. And now I want to emit particles from this circle. So I can add in a pop network. Just a standard pop network wired in the first input and activate it. And you see by default, the pop network is already emitting particles. If you press play, there are more and more particles emitted. Now let's dive in there and let's give them some movement. So we can use these attributes here on the pop source node. Here you can either choose to use inherited velocity or to set an initial velocity. And I want to set an initial velocity. And in our case, let's just zero out the X values here in velocity and variance. Let's put the velocity on Y to a value of 2 with a variance of 1. That's fine. And let's also zero out the variance on Z. Now we will get particles that fly upwards, and they do this with a little bit different, a bit of variance in their speed. So that's fine. But these are way too much because then we cannot really see the particle trails that we will create in the next step. So let's turn down the constant birth rate to about 15. Then we only get a few particles that will fly upwards. Okay, so that's it. That's all we have to do for now in our pop network. So let's go out of that. And now I want to create the particle trails. So I want to use a trails node. Let's apply the trails node. And you see by default, it only creates particle trails. So now it is set to a length of 2. If I set it to a length of, let's say, 25, then this will be a little bit more obvious. So each frame for 25 frames, it will create a particle that's following the first one in the movement, as you can see here. Now these trails are of course not primitive, so they are not connected. They are only points. If you take a look here, these are just points. Now, if we want to connect them, we have to use an add node. So let's add in the add node. And with the add node, you can add points to your scene, but you can also do other things. So if we activate this for a moment and go to polygons, here we have this by pattern or by group. And in this case, I want to use by group. And if I just switch it to by group, you see already now my lines are all connected. And this is already pretty cool, but it's not a particle trail. And that's because it is now connecting all points. But I want to connect only points by an attribute. So we choose by attribute, and the attribute that you can use to connect these lines is the ID attribute. So you can type in ID, and now you see that we have lines that are only connecting the trails that come out of our pop network, or of our trail node in this case. And if we take a look here at the primitive numbers. You see each of these is now a primitive and has its own number, and that's pretty good. That's what we want. Now, if you only want to have very simple particle trails, then you're already done. But I want to show you a few more tricks that you can do. For example, what if you want to create trails that have different length? Right now, the length is specified by this value here, so the trail length. So this is the overall trail length. And now we can, with a little bit of vex, we can actually create random length of our trails. So let's do that. But before we do that, I want to create a curve view attribute. So let's add in a resample node, and I'm sure that you already saw this trick. So if you want to use the resample node, and I do not even want to resample these right now in this step. I could do it, but it's not really necessary. You see, it is already resampling it because this is turned on, but I could turn this off for now because I don't need it right now. I only want to calculate this attribute here, the curve view attribute. So activate this here, and then you have the curve view attribute. If we visualize this for a moment, so let's go to the curve view here and visualize this. Let's turn off these points. This will add a value from 0 to 1 along the full length of each of our trails. So as you can see here, it's adding this value. And we can use this value then to create a variation of different, or to create random length of our trails. Good. I will just rename this to set curve view because that's actually what this is doing. Just set curve view. Okay, now we will create a point wrangle. And this is probably really the most complicated part of this tutorial. So it's really straightforward. And here we just have to do a little bit of coding. Now, first of all, I want to create a random number for each of these primitives. So for each of these lines, and let me actually turn off this visualizer for now again. And then I will just compare this to our curve view, so to the value between 0 and 1, and delete some points. So we will type in here if parentheses curve view. And actually I have to say that this is an attribute. So at curve view, that's important, and I always forget it, is bigger than, and now let's create a random number based on the ID of our primitives. So random number at ID, and close the parentheses, and now curly brackets. Then we want to remove point, and we can use this function here, remove point, from our stream number 1. So this is input number 1 here. And then we want to remove at pt num, so the point number, whatever it is currently calculating. And now we can end our curly brackets. And this should already, And you see this is already working, and now our trails have different sizes, different length. What if I want to have more control over this? So now I cannot even adjust anything here. It is just based on a random value created based on the ID. What I could do here is, first of all, I could introduce a seed. And therefore I want to create an integer variable. So let's choose integer and call it seed. And this is an integer slider, so channel integer, which I also call seed. And that's it. So let's create this slider. And now we can set up a value here and then just add it to our ID, because then we will randomize this with our seed, like so. Now if I change the seed, you see that the distribution is changing. Cool. But there's still not a lot of control. I also want to be able to control the minimum and the maximum length of these trails. So how can we do that? And we can actually do that the following way. We just have to apply or just add in a variable for the minimum length and the maximum length, and then we can fit this together with our random number here. So let's do that. Let's create a float. This will be our minimum length, and this will also be defined by a slider. But in this case, I want to use a channel float slider, so a float value, and call this just minimum, like so. That's it. And then we can just copy this here, this line of code, and call it maximum slider and create this maximum slider. So let's now create these two sliders. You see now we have the minimum and the maximum slider. I will put in some values that these do something here. These are actually multipliers. So these will actually multiply with the trail lengths that we set up here on our trail node. And you will see this in a moment. But now we have to get it somehow into our code here. And to get it into our code, I want to use a fit 0,1 function because I want to fit the number that we have here between to a value of 0 and 1, because this is actually what our curve U requires, because curve U is also between 0 and 1. So I use fit 0,1. And now I want to let me take a look here so that I make this the right way. Yeah, here exactly. I want to put in our minimum and maximum value. So here I can put in my minimum value now and my maximum value now. And then I think I have to close the parenthesis one more time again. And now this should work. So let's take a look what we have here. So now if I change the minimum length, you see that it is actually really changing. And if I change the maximum length, this should also work. So now I can really specify the length of my particle trails and I have full control over it. So that's pretty cool. And you will also find this code here in the video description, or maybe I also write it into a comment so that you can just copy paste it and that you don't have to type it in yourself. Okay, so this is working, and let's call this set random length. That's okay, set random length. And we can also colorize this so that we know this is an important node where we can change something. We can also colorize this one here because here we can change the overall size. So you see this one here changes our minimum and maximum length, but if I change this overall size, then this still has a huge impact on the look of our trails. Okay, so right now we only have these lines, and I actually can render these lines, for example, with Redshift. You can render it as strands or as cylinders or different methods here, but I do not have any p-scale applied to these lines here. And if I use a sweep node for a moment to make these or turn these into geometry, let's use a sweep node down here, activate it, and choose instead of surface shape second input cross, let's use round tube. And now you immediately see what I have here. So let's invert the cross section because the normals are inverted here. You see I have no scalar value, no p-scale along these lines, these trails. Of course, the sweep node has an option here to apply a scale along the curve, and I could use that to bring it in, as you see here. But if I do not want to use geometry to render, if I only want to use the hair renderer, for example, then I want to have my p-scale written to these trails. And that's what we are going to do now. So let's make this visible that we see what we are actually doing. So now we will use another wrinkle here to create our p-scale along the length of our trails. So let's add in another point wrinkle. Point wrinkle. And now let's type the following code. So at p-scale should be, I want to use a channel ramp here this time. And this is called the thickness. And I want to run this, map this over our curve view attribute. So let's run this again over our curve view attribute. And I also want to have an overall scale multiplier. So I will just multiply this with another channel float in this case, and this will just be our scale. And let me actually press Alt-E here to make this big so that we can see what's going on here. So channel float scale, of course I have to close the parentheses here. And then I just can apply an accept and create both of these controls here. You see I have my scalar now. Let's set this to 1, and then I have this thickness here. And what's happening now, you see it's pretty similar than we had it here with this ramp. We can actually turn this off now. We have now our own creation. And this is not only working with the sweep, this is now also working when you're using, for example, the Redshift hair renderer. Now let's set this up that this makes sense. In the beginning, we want these to grow a bit faster, and then they should stay thick, and then I want them to get thin again, like so. And now we can select all of this by holding down Shift, and we can apply another interpolation. Well, let's do it right here because then you can see it. And I want to use this Catmull Room for now, or Catmull Rum, it's actually called. And then I can just scale it down to 0.01, and then these will be very thin. Maybe this was a little bit too much. But right now you see now I have these thin lines. And they are geometry, of course, because of our sweep. But if I turn this off, now the p-scale is actually really written into these lines. And this is what the renderer will read out and will display. So let's call this here set p-scale. And we can also colorize this red for now, because then we know there are some important things going on this one here. Now, there is one problem. If we take a look again at our sweep, and let's make this bigger so that it is a little bit more obvious what's going on here. If you take a look here at these lines, at a certain point, for example, right here, it's not tapering down in the end. It's just being cut off here as well. Some of them are tapering in more in the end. Why is that? That is because our curfew is actually calculated over the whole length of our trails initially, because it's calculated right here, so at this point. But then we are removing some points, but the curfew value will just end there. So if you take a look at the curfew value down here, let's do that. Let's actually take a look at the curfew value. Let's visualize this. You see that they do not end with a value of 0, which would be red. They are just cut off wherever we remove the points with our wrangle. We can create another curfew attribute by adding in another resample node. So let's do that. Let's add another resample node and put it in before our set scale attribute wrangle. And now we will again calculate the curfew. But this time we call it curfew 1. Now we have two different curfew values. The first of them is controlling our set random length, and the second one we can use to specify our p-scale. So let's do that. Let's go into our wrangle again, and instead of curfew, I can now, oops, sorry, now I entered it. I don't want to enter it. I can now just put in here curfew 1. And if I do that, you will immediately see now they're tapering down over their full length. So now we have two options, and yeah, you can change this anytime, however you want. So now you can come in here and decide whatever you want. You can use curfew, or you can use the curfew 1. But of course, it makes a little bit more sense to use curfew 1. So let's turn off our visualizer and let's bring down the size of these again so that these are nice and thin. Okay, so this is basically it. Now we have a very flexible setup that we can apply to any pop network, and we will create particle trails, and we have some pretty cool controls here. Another thing that we can do is that we really resample them, because right now this one here we only used to set the curfew attribute, or to calculate it actually, and this one here we can really use to resample them. If you take a look now, there are not that many points, and if they are bending, for example, and we can do this in the next step, we can take a look at that, it's probably better if we resample them. So before I'm talking here, let me show you this. So let's add in a point warp here, and let's just add in some displacement, some noise. So let's activate this and go to our enter it. And I will just give myself a little bit of room here. Now we can use, for example, an anti-aliased noise. And we want to do the following. We want to connect the B to this position input here because it requires a position input. Then we can add this to our current position of our points, like so. And add this in here. Now we are adding these two together. And if we go up here and change this noise here from 1D noise to 2D noise, now you see we have some displacement going on. And if I make this a little bit smoother and play this now, you see what we have. Now these are flowing through our noise field. And yeah, that can look quite good, but you see also that we do not have enough resolution on our points, and that's why I said we have to resample them. So now we could do this before here with our resample. Just take a look how much we need, maybe 0.05 and then change this from straight edges to subdivision curves. And now we should get some nice and smooth lines. Yeah, this looks already way better. So this way you can add in some displacement to these straight particle lines. There is another option that I want to show you. For example, if you want to map this noise now over the age of your trails, so the older or the longer they're traveling, the more the noise will change them. And this is also very simple. What we can do here now is that we use a ramp. And that's actually now really similar as what we did in the Vex wrangles before. So now I'm doing it in VOPs. And yeah, VOP and Vex is more or less the same. It's just visual language. And here we can take our age. And before we bring it into our ramp, we want to make sure that we fit it, because it is actually, it should be a value of 0 to 1 if you bring it into your ramp. Now let's change our ramp from a color ramp to a spline ramp, this one here. So let's take a look what values we have to put in here. So what is the maximum age that we want to take into account? And let's say that we want to take into account about 4 to 5 seconds. Yeah, let's say we want to take into account 5 seconds. If you take a look at the geometry spreadsheet, you see the age is right here. And you see that the oldest ones are now 5 seconds old and the youngest ones are just born, so they are at 0. So this is the range that I want to influence, and we can set this now, the source max to 5, and we remap this age here to 0 to 1, feed it into our ramp, and now we can multiply it with the output of our add here. So let's put in a multiply right here, and then bring in the ramp, and that's it. Okay, let's go back to our scene view. Now we can set up our ramp here. You see in the beginning, there is nearly no influence, and then over a certain amount of time, we can grow this influence, and we can even do it like this. And now we can maybe change the interpolation here to something like that. Then we have a smooth transition here. And you see that now, okay, there's one strange thing happening, and that is now that everything is moved to a point in the middle. And that is actually because I actually linked this up the wrong way. I want to multiply it, of course, before I add it to the current position, because otherwise I am multiplying the position with null or with 0. And then, of course, everything is put into the center. So that's not what I want. So this is the right way. Do it the right way. We'll just put this in here, and this in here, this in here. And now this should work. So now I'm adding the position value that I get out of this calculation after I apply the ramp. So after my multiply. And let's link this up also correctly so that this looks nice. And this is a bit understandable now. So this is what I wanted to do. You see in the beginning now, these are not deformed by the noise. And when they approach a certain age, like here, then the noise will have full effect. So this is just a small example of what you can do with these trails. And yeah, that's what I wanted to show you. Another thing that is cool, if you want to use different colors, for example, along the length here, you can put in a color node and add it in here. And then you can say, I want to colorize these a ramp from attribute, and I want to use the attribute, and that can be curve U or curve U1 in our case. And then you see they will be colored from black and white over the whole length. And of course, you can use this later on for shading and give them different colors. Okay, so this is it with this part. In the next part of this tutorial series, I want to show you how you can create a simple digital asset out of this setup that you created now, that you can then reuse and add to any pop network that you want. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next part. Welcome to part 2 of my particle trails tutorial series. In this part, I want to show you how you can quickly create a digital asset, so a Houdini digital asset, also called an HDA. And you can also follow along this part of the tutorial if you want to create any digital asset. So this is not specific for the project that I'm working on. Of course, I will show you how to create the asset out of the nodes that I created in part number 1 of this tutorial series, but you can actually use this technique and create whatever HDA you want. So let's jump right into it. You see, I have my project where we left off last time still open, and I want to create an HDA of all the nodes that are creating my particle trails. And these are actually all of these here. So I want to use this trail and also the set p-scale and all the in-between nodes to create my HDA. I do not want to include this warp here, and I also do not want to include this color here because these things are specific, and yeah, you can add this later on just after the HDA. To create an HDA, select the nodes that you want to include into your HDA, and then you can just right-click, and then we can go to Actions, and then we can say Collapse to Subnet. You see there is also a shortcut, which is Shift-C. So let's do that. Now I have my subnet here. And I will just name it already here, and I call it GIM for graphicinmotion, and then these are the particle trails. So particle trails, this will be also the name of my HDA. Now, if I dive inside here, you see what happened here. So let's press, let's not press L. Let's just shift this over here a little bit, and then you can see what's happening. Let me take a look whether I'm in the way. No, not really. And all of my nodes now were shifted into the subnet. So here is the input from subnet, from our subnet number 1. And then all the nodes are in here now. And then we have this output here. And of course, the input here is this first input, and the output here is the last input. We would have some other inputs here of our subnet, but actually we will not use them. But this is not a problem for now. Now I want to turn this subnet into an HDA that you can then load in like every other node into Houdini. So to do that, right-click here, and then we have this digital asset down here, and I can just click Create New. Now you can give a name to this digital asset, and I already named my node, my subnetwork, so the name is already taken over here. And then, yeah, you can specify the author, you can specify a branch if you have a company structure that you want to assign it to, but I do not need this, so we'll just turn it off. And you can also assign a version here. In my case, this is version 1, and everything is all right here. Then you can see that there is the folder where this will be saved. So inside your documents folder, if you are on Windows, you can find this Houdini 19.5. Then there is this OTLS, that's another name for HDAs. So, and there you can then find this HDALC, that's the file name. And yeah, if you save it in there, then you can access it right in Houdini as every other node. I will show you this in a moment. Here you see the menu entry, digital asset. This is in the tab menu. I will show you this in a moment too. And here you can see the asset label. This will be GIM particle trails, but I want my GIM to be actually in capitals because I think I did this on my other assets as well. So everything is fine here. One more thing, if you download this scene file, and you can of course download the scene file on Patreon, so you will get the project file of everything that we are doing in this tutorial series, and you will also get this file here. So this Saab Roland Hartmann GIM particle trail HDA that you can then just install into this folder, into the OTLS folder on your machine, and then you can use it for future projects. So if you want to get this, then please jump over to Patreon, and you can use the project file tier to get these files. If you want to check out the whole premium content that I have there, then please choose the full access tier. This will of course also be included there. Okay, but now let's create this HDA. So let's click Create. And now we are inside the settings of this HDA. Here you see we have the minimum inputs, maximum outputs. In our case, we only need one maximum input and one maximum output because, yeah, there's only one stream of nodes and we do not need anything else. And then there's a very important feature, and these are the parameters. So the parameter tab here on the HDA is exactly the same if you are familiar with that. For example, if you select a node and you go up here and go to Edit Parameter Interface, you see this is very similar. So if you have ever done this, that you set up custom parameters for a node, it's exactly the same workflow. But you have to be a little bit careful because, for example, if I turn off now or close my digital asset parameters, and then I want to add some custom controls to my digital asset, and I click here and do Edit Parameter Interface, and then I start editing these, this will not have an influence on our digital asset. This will only have an influence on the node that you're currently working on. If you really want to create controls for your digital asset, make sure that you go to select the asset in here, this one here, go to Asset, and then go Edit Asset Properties, GIM particle trails in this case, and then you are again on these parameters here, and now we can set up these custom controls. Now let me show you how you can set up custom controls for your digital asset. Of course, this is different for each asset that you want to create because you want to control, of course, different parameters. But in my case, the first one that I want to add in here is actually the trail length. This is the overall trail length, and I will just add it to my root. Now I can specify a name here. And I like to name these the same in the label, and here, just here it is a little bit different. And here I name it what I really want to see on my controls. So this is the trail length, and yeah, I think that this is all right. Between 0 or between 1 and 10, that's fine. Then what else do I need? I do not need anything from my add node. I do not need any control from my set curve view node, but I definitely want to use some controls here on my set random length. I want to use the seed here, so let's add this in here. I want to use the minimum slider and also the maximum slider. Now the seed slider is an integer slider, that's fine. And I think the range is also okay. The minimum slider is a float slider, that's also fine. The range is fine, should be between 0 and 1, that's okay. And as you see, these are now not locked, so that means you can go to this number and drag it below 1, and you can also drag it above 1. But yeah, it's not that important in our case. I think that we are good with this slider. I could lock these because these are actually multipliers, but I don't care about this now. That's fine. Now, the next setting on the resample node, this time I actually really want to use this resample length here because I want to be able to control it outside of my digital asset. So let's add this in here and change this name now. So I want to say this is the resample length, and I will also change it here, resample length in the name. The slider range here is between 0 and 5. Yeah, we could do that. Let's leave it like that on the standard values. Now we also want to use some parameters from our p-scale wrangle here. First of all, I want to choose, of course, the overall scale. So this is my, let's say, overall scale. I could also call it overall thickness. That's probably even more understandable. So let's do that because otherwise it's maybe a little bit confusing. So let's call it overall thickness. And I think that the range here can be a bit higher. No, it's not necessary because trails are usually very small. So let's leave it like that, but I will not close, so I will not clamp these values here. And of course, I also want to have this ramp here. So let's take this here and put it in here. And yeah, this should also be good. Here we have the label, here with the name. Everything is all right. Now, if I apply and accept, you see, if I go outside of my HDA now and select it, you see that now I have all of these controls here. And if I tab now and put in GIM here, you see we have these particle trails digital asset. And you see I already created one before while practicing this tutorial. And if I bring this in here now, and this is actually the one that I created before, you see that I have my asset here. Now I can put in an input here, and I have all the specs here that I can change. But I also want to lay this out a little bit nicer because now I want to add in a separator here, and I don't like this here because it's sticking on the top here quite, it's very narrow here, so we need a little bit more room here. So let's go to Asset again, Edit Asset Properties, and let's do some organizing here. And down here you can find the separator. So I want to put a separator between these view controls and between or above these two thickness controls. And I can just put a spacer up here. And if I apply and accept, now you see it will look a little bit nicer. Okay, so now we have created the first digital asset and we can now use this in a project. And this is actually what I want to show you in the next part of this tutorial series. In the next part of the tutorial series, I want to go over a project that I actually created for a client where I used this digital asset, or actually I really developed it while working for this client. And I want to give you a little example how you can use this asset. And I also want to give you a bit more insights how you can create different types of particle trails or of curve trails, and how you can make these follow along some curves that you draw. And yeah, we'll have a little bit of fun, a little bit more fun with particle trails in the next part. So thank you very much for your support and thank you very much for watching. Goodbye. Welcome to part 3 of our tutorial series about particle trails in Houdini. And in this part, I want to show you how to use the HDA that we created in the last 2 parts. And I want to give you a bit of a practical example how to use this in production. So you can again download the whole project file and also the HDA over on Patreon. So if you want to get this file, then please check out Patreon and you can choose the project file tier if you only want to get the project file. If you want to watch all my exclusive tutorials, my premium courses, and get the project files for these tutorials as well, then you can choose the full access tier. And thank you very much for your support. This makes it possible that I create tutorials, that I keep my channel rolling. Okay, now let's get started and let's take a look. Last time we left off here, basically. You see that we created this GRM particle trails HDA. And yeah, I showed you some other tricks here. And now I set up a simple scene with a camera here and some lines. So there are only 2 curves for now here. And if we go out of the camera and go to the perspective mode, you see what they are doing. I just created some simple lines. And yeah, I wanted to have a little bit of an offset in Z space. And I also wanted to have a little bit of an offset from left to right so that we have nice movements. And I think you're familiar with the curve tool. I only created these as polygons, as you see here. So just very simple with a few points, and then I just turned them into NURBS. And that's pretty much it. I will show you one little trick that, yeah, may be worth mentioning. I use a setup with 2 views here. So I split my viewport and actually do these 2 views side by side. Then I use one of them as a top perspective and the other one I will set to camera, because this way you really know what you are doing. So now I can come in here and choose the tool. And you see now if I change, for example, this point here, you see whenever I'm moving into the scene or when I'm moving too far out, I can position it really good like this. And that's the way how I really like to set these up, because then I have full control. I know where my points are on the Z axis and I know where they are exactly on the view of my camera. So this is how I created these curves here. And now I want to use my trails HDA with these curves. So how can we do that? First of all, we need, of course, a particle simulation, because that is what is required by our HDA. So let's create a simple particle simulation here. And to do that, again, I need an emitter. And as an emitter, I want to use a circle again. So let's create a circle. And in this case, I will use a primitive here. And I'll go out of the top view here, just to the perspective view. And let's take a look. You see, it is very big. So let's turn it down. And I think that, let's see, I will start with 0.3 for now. And now I want to make sure to line this circle up with my curve. So if I take this curve first of all, so I'm starting with this curve, let's see where point number 1 is. And right now, if I click on these points, you see there are not really many points on this. So I should probably resample it. And that's what I want to do. So let's add in a resample node and just add a few more points in there, and I change it to subdivision curves. That's okay. Now, I want my circle to be aligned with point number 0, so with the beginning of my line. And to do that, I will use a copy to points node. So let's add this in. And now we can copy the circle directly to my curve, my line. As you see, by default, the copy to points is, of course, copying our circle to all of the points. But I can specify a point number here in the target points. And if I put in 0 here, then it copies it only to point number 0, right to the beginning of my curve. Let me show you one more thing. In case if your, let's turn off these points here. In case if your line is facing the wrong direction, that is also relevant with the direction the particles will travel. You can revert it pretty easily. So you go only to the curves node, select it, and then you can select or choose the tool here, this curve tool. And then you can select all points and just click this reverse button here. And by doing that, if we take a look now, you see that our emitter jumped to this point. Now this is reversed. This is also taken into account by the resample node. So let's undo that and let's make sure that we are back to where we were before. Just some undos. Yeah, here we go. Now, another problem that we see here is that our circle, the emitter, is not lined up with the direction of our curve. And there's a simple solution for that as well. Orient along curve, it's called. And if you put this in here, right after the resample, you see that now our circle, the emitter, jumps into place. So you see without this and with it, it now points directly into the direction of this curve. So that's pretty handy. Okay, so far so good. So now my emitter is in place. And why am I doing all of this? Because now if I want to come in here and make changes to my curve, then the emitter will follow along. So that's the simple reason, because, you know, during this project I was talking about, I had, of course, to change the paths quite a bit, and it's very useful if your emitter is just following along the curve automatically. And now we actually can create our particle simulation. So let's put down a pop network. And let's wire it up the following. So I want my emitter to be this copy to points node. So let's put it in here. And on the other side, on the second input, I want to put in my curve. And now let's dive into my simulation here. If we run the simulation now, we should get a few particles on our disk, on our circle, and we do, as you see here. But of course, they do not move because they have no velocity. Now I want to move the particles along my curve, and therefore I will use a curve pop force. So it is called pop curve force. Yeah, that's the one. And just drag it in here. And now we have to specify a curve. And instead of a SOP, I will just put in the second context geometry. That is, of course, our input here. So now if you take a look at that, you see this area here, and that is defined by the influence radius. So all of the forces that you see here, we will go through this in a moment, are actually living inside this area that these guide lines are here representing. And in the middle, we have our curve. So this red line in the middle is our curve, actually. Now, if I press play by default, then these particles will start to follow along the curve. And you see they will create a very strange shape, like a bottle, nearly. And of course, I don't want this. I want these to be the source particles for my trails. So first of all, I do not need that many. Let's go to the birth tab and let's set this down to a small value like 25. And I also don't want the particle trails to fly so far out from my initial curve. So I will just turn down this influence radius to a very small amount, or to a smaller amount, I should say. The only thing that is important here is that your radius of the emitter should be smaller than your influence radius, so that there is a little bit of space around it. And now this works as following. You see that these particles start to flow along my line, and by default, with the default settings, this already works quite nice. Now, you have the follow scale. If I crank this up quite a bit, this determines how fast these flow along my line. But you see that there is one problem. If you take a look down here, and I hope you can see this in the screen recording, maybe I have to go and make my particles a bit bigger. So let's take a look where I can do that. Right here. So if I set it to 5 for a moment, yeah, this makes it a bit simpler to see. I hope this is better. So you see now they're shooting out here just straight. And this is just because the force is now, or the velocity is so high that the follow scale, the suction scale are not really able to control them. So if I have a very, very high force, like this 10, then I need also a very high suction force, so like 10, for example. And now you will see what's happening now. Now they will be able to follow along my curve again because the suction force is sucking them towards the original line. But this is anyway way too fast, so I don't want this. I just wanted to show you this as an example. So let's put in another value here, and let's go with some decent values here. Now you see they're traveling around our spline or our curve, and you see again that they are leaving. So you can balance this out between the follow scale, the suction scale, and the orbit scale, but you can also just change this air resistance here. The air resistance more or less is like a scalar value here. So the higher you put in of an air resistance, the more they will follow along these forces here. So if you see now I put it to 5, and now they are following my curve way more accurate, and they're also moving faster through it. So I'm not quite sure whether it is really a multiplier. Maybe it's not really a multiplier, but it is very useful if you want to control the behavior of the particles a little bit better. And let's go to our camera 1 and let's take a look how this movement looks now. So now they're coming in, they're swirling nicely around my curve actually, so I really like that. And this is defined by this orbit scale. So if I turn this to 0, you will see the outcome will be quite different. Now they will not orbit around our curve, but they will be sucked to it. And that's why they are forming, or they're moving in this line here. So the suction scale makes them come to the middle here. And this looks a little bit boring. So that's not that interesting. So I definitely want to have some orbit scale in there, but maybe not quite that much. So maybe I will set it to 0.75 for now. And let's take a look what this does. Then we should not get that much of a spiral movement. And you see the suction force is a little bit too high now because they are being sucked into the middle a little bit too much. So I also turn this down to, let's say, 0.75, and let's see what this does. Maybe this is already something that we can use. This looks quite nice now. They're now maybe a little bit too slow for my taste. So I will just increase the follow scale a little bit, slightly. Let's take a look. Yeah, that looks a bit better. And then you also have this fall off forces here. And yeah, you see we have a fall off force for the follow, or a fall off for the follow force, I should say. Then the fall off for the suction force for the orbit force. And inherited velocity, yeah, is only important if you have already some velocity in your scene, which we do not have. So we can just ignore that for now. You see the follow force fall off means that in the middle of our area here, so directly on our curve, the force will be 1, and outside of this area, it will be 0. So it will be mapped throughout the radius here. But I don't want that. So I want to have a value still on the side here. So I will set this to 0.5. And now these should move a little bit faster, and they will not get that slow, as you see now. Now I have a problem that some of them are already leaving again. So I can maybe turn my follow scale here, the force down a bit. Let's take a look. Yeah, this doesn't look too bad. That's quite nice. And actually I will increase the orbit scale again because now they are not orbiting enough for my taste. Yeah, that should be fine. So you can play with these values on your own. I don't want to waste too much time now. But yeah, be aware that there are these fall off things that can really be helpful when art directing these movements. But now let's do one more thing, and let's limit our emission to a certain time. And I think that I will just limit it to the first 3 seconds. So I will put in $SF for simulation frame. And this should be smaller than 75 frames because I'm working with 25 frames per minute per second. And this, of course, means that I'm limiting it to 3 seconds. Then it will be turned off, the emission. And then they fly through. Let's take a look at that from here. They come in, do a few swirls, and then they move out. That's perfect. Okay. Now it's time to bring in our HDA that we created in the last 2 episodes. So let's bring in the GIM particle trails. And you see, I have it now here in with my usual tab menu. And I just can bring it in. And by default, this should already work. Now you see we have particle trails. And they have everything that you remember before. So I have this scalar value here. I have this minimum and maximum length settings. So I can change this here, as you can see. So you can art direct your particle trails here really easily. So one more time, let me mention, if you want to get the project file and this HDA, then please check out Patreon. A link is in the video description. Okay, so far so good. So you see, it's really a very simple setup now. So we have these particle trails here. And if we want to apply all of this now to our second curve, the only thing we have to do is to copy all of that. So let's just simply copy this over. And we can now just put in our second curve and activate this. And now you see that we get particle trails right here. And actually, we do not get particle trails because I didn't copy the HDA. So let's do that here. And now we get particle trails. The only thing that we have to check now is that we change the settings that they match this curve here. And actually, I'm not sure why this curve is now. Oh yeah, they're just shooting out. So I think that the suction force is not high enough. So let's go in here and change some settings. And I want these to be maybe a tiny bit faster. So let's just set the suction force also a bit higher and maybe this also a bit higher. And let's see how this looks now. Let's activate the trails that we see them. And let's see how this looks. And now you see the suction force is too high. So I have to turn this down. Let's take a look. I don't want them to move too close to my line. Now it's not high enough. So let's do this step by step. And that's something that you have to do from time to time, that you just start figuring out these values slowly. Now you see they are not leaving our force anymore, but I also think that they are not orbiting around enough. So let's just increase this orbit scale a bit again. Let's take a look at that. Now they're orbiting a bit nicer. Yeah, that's actually cool, but I want to even increase this. I want to have more orbits here. Yeah, this looks a little bit better. Okay, let's say this is fine. Now we can take a look at the trails, how this is looking. And I think that this looks pretty nice. Okay, so this was the workflow that I actually created for this client project. And then we also wanted the main line to be visible. So I wanted to have one main particle line or stroke that is guiding more or less the other ones and that the other ones can swirl around. So I wanted to create also an object that is traveling along my main curve. And to do that, there are several ways. What you could do, for example, is you could use a carve node. So you can, for example, choose a carve node. And if we activate this, you can then just animate these lines here. So you can just cut it off and animate this through. And this way you can create a line that is traveling along our main curve. But I chose to do another thing because here I have to animate 2 values and I'm lazy. So I only wanted to animate 1 value. And I also wanted to have a geometry for my main line. I will show this in the next part, how to render these things. It's really simple, but in the case of the main line, I wanted to have some geometry just because it's easier to do actually. So let's do that. Let's create an object that we can then align to our path. So let's create a line for this. And this also has a reason why I use a line here and not only a tube. So stick with me, I will explain it in a moment. And I want to make sure that the direction of this is 1 on set, I should say, so that it is laying flat on in our scene. Now I want to sweep this. So I want to create some geometry around this line. And before I do that, let me actually resample it. This makes more sense because right now we have not enough points here. I want to resample it. So let's do that here, like so. Let's take a look how many points we have. Yeah, that should be fine. I'll maybe turn it down to a bit more so that we have smooth curves later on. And now we can just sweep it and use a round tube for that. And it will be very thin, so we do not need that many columns here. I think that this should be fine. If you take a look, Shift W on the wireframe. Yeah, for now, I will leave it at this. Now I want this line to follow along my curve. And there is this cool node that's called path deform. And this requires two inputs. So the geometry to deform, that's my, oops, not all of them, only the last one. That's my sweep here. And then we need the curve, of course, and this will be this one here. And if I activate this now, you will see if it works, it should now align it. So let me zoom out here a little bit and let's take a look where it is. You see it is right here. And now I can only animate one value, and this is this curve offset here, this position. And that's very handy actually, because now I can retime, or now I can time my main line together with my small lines here. So you can template this, and now we can animate these together. The only problem that you see now is that this is not long enough. So let's increase the size of our line. So we do this right here. And let's see how much we need, maybe 10. Let's zoom out here a little bit. Let's see how long 10 is. And if I go to my path deform and just set this back a little bit, yeah, this is actually good. So I will leave it at 10. And now, and this is also why this path deform is useful, because I can use the sweep scale now to apply a scale over this length here. It's very similar to what we did before when we manipulated the P scale with the vector angle, with the point angle. But now I will just do it like this and just use this curve here. It's a little bit simpler, faster. So let's just do it like that. Set up a simple curve, choose all of these here, and make them interpolation. Let's do it here, then you can see it. Interpolation, let's say monotone cubic for now. And if we take a look at that now, then yeah, it looks like this. And it is of course too thick overall. So let's change the radius to 0.01, and then it should be nice and thin. Okay, now let's merge these two together and let's just animate this. So that's very important to animate this. Let's select it and let's take a look so that we time this. And I also want to do that in the camera view because then I can see what it's doing. I know that I want to start at position 0. So if I start at position 0, yeah, you see it's not totally gone because it is very long, but it's no problem because I can actually drag this into the negative values. And right around here, let's say wherever I need to start. Oh, sorry, like so. So at around, what do we have? Minus 0.51, you see that it is outside of my screen. So I will start here, add a keyframe, alt-click. Now let's run the simulation because I want to see when my lines come in and I want to create a nice timing. So now they are leaving here. So we can scroll through this now. At this point, I want my main line to be out of the screen here. So let's drag it over. Let's take a look until there. Then I create another keyframe. And then let's take a look when it should be gone totally. And I think right here, it could be off screen already. Let's take a look like so. And another keyframe. And I could actually set this to 1. And we have nicer values to manipulate. Now let's take a look at this all together. It's coming in here, speeding through, and going off. And you see right here, it's still a little bit visible. So I want to make sure that I update this keyframe to 1. And again, keyframe this. If you want to manipulate it, shift click, of course, then you can take a look at your keyframes. And I think I can delete the middle one here and can just manipulate this like so. I don't want to ease so much. I just want this to be a little bit more linear. And I think that this should now work. Comes in, the other lines follow along. Maybe it is a little bit too fast now in the beginning. So what I could do is just move this over a bit. Like so. Let's take a look. Oh, sorry, I'm out of my recording area here. So you could not see what I'm doing here. I just manipulated this here So let's take a look at that again. Yeah, now I just pushed it a bit too far, so I will bring this in again a little bit. And this way I can just time these two animations. Like so. Yep, that looks nice. Okay. Good, the animation is in place. And of course, now I can do the same thing for the other particle, but I won't do that now. You can take a look at the final project that you can download on Patreon. There, everything is set up. Or you can just do it alone, because now you know how to do it. And there's one more thing. The client at one time came and said, it would be nice if there are some particles in the scene. And because this is Houdini and it is so cool, we can do this in a very, very simple way. And this is also one reason why I wanted to use some geometry here, because I can use it to create some particles and it's pretty simple. So let's create another pop network here to add some particles to this scene. And we can go directly from our path deform here and can take this as an emission. So if we activate these particles now, you see right away we have some particles in here. Now they do not move, of course, but they are already spawning on the surface of our object here. So to move them, I will come in here, and first of all, under the Attributes tab, I can set an initial velocity here. And I want to use an inherited velocity. But the problem is, as you see, it is not working. It should take over the velocity of our geometry. But actually, because this is a path deform, there is no velocity attribute. As you see here, we only have position for now. So we have to calculate this velocity, and therefore we can use, again, the trail node here. So let's put this in here, and let's set this to compute velocity. And by doing that and re-simulating, you will see the behavior now is very different of our particles. Now they are shooting out in the direction of our velocities here. This is not exactly what I want, but it's a good starting point. So let's go to the pop network, and we will turn down this value a little bit. So set it to 0.5, then it will inherit half of the velocity. And this looks pretty good. Now there are only two things I want to add, actually three. Actually four. So I want to add in a pop drag, first of all, to make them a bit slower during this simulation. And let's see how much air resistance I really need here. If I put in 1, they are already way slower, as you can see here. And let me turn down the point size now again, because now they are a bit too big. I would say, yeah, that's better. So something like that. That looks quite nice. So I will leave the air resistance at 1. Now let's put in a pop force to add some turbulent displacement here. We could also do that with the pop warp and add some noises, but I think this is okay. So let's take a look at that. I will just add a value of 1 here. As you can see, looks pretty good. The swirl size is maybe a bit too big, so I will just turn this down a tiny bit, maybe turn down the roughness a tiny bit. Let's see how this looks now. Yeah, that's a bit better. And I just want to turn down the amplitude also a bit, so maybe 0.75. Let's take a look. And that's fine. And as a final step, I want to, again, control the size of these particles. And I want to control the size of these particles over life. So what we can do here is, again, use a pop warp. And it's exactly the same setup that I used before with these trails in the first part, if you watched it. If not, I would recommend that you do so, because then you can learn way more. And now I just want to bring in the age and a p-scale value that we do not have right now. So let's actually bind in a p-scale value, and by choosing bind, or by putting in a bind parameter, I can create an attribute actually, because I think that these, or actually they do have p-scale, do they? Let me take a look. They have, no, there's no p-scale on them. Yeah, doesn't matter. We're creating p-scale right now. So here we have p-scale. And then again, as I did before, I want to fit the range of my age. I want to put this through a ramp parameter. This should be a spline ramp, like so. And then I want to multiply this. So let's say multiply my p-scale value with my ramp value here. And then we can bind export this. So we can export it again to p-scale. Like so. And now we can go up one level. Actually, there is an option, another option that we could do. I could bring in another multiplier just as a constant value. So if I, or not a constant, a parameter actually, because this way I can just, no, this was the wrong thing. I just need a parameter, standard value or standard node, this one here. Yeah, let's make a little bit more room here. Because if I multiply this in here as well, then I have an overall multiplier and I can name this now my overall scale. And I think that this is fine. Now, the only thing that I have to do is to put in my min and max values here. So what I want to map from the age. And to do that, I have to specify the lifespan of my particles. And I think I don't want them to live that long. So I think 3 seconds should be the maximum. So let's go to my source here and let's go to birth and let's set the life expectancy to maybe 1 or 2.5 and then a variation of, let's say, 1. And let's see what this does now. So they will die off between 1.5 seconds and 3.5 seconds. And this is a little bit too much. So let's do it 2. Then I think this should work. Yeah, that looks a little bit better. Now they are gone. And what I can do, I can just deactivate the emitter here at around maybe, yeah, let's say 175 frames. So again, as I did it before, $SF should be smaller than 175. Good, so this is a very fast particle setup. As you can see here, we have just some particles. And there's one more thing I want to do. So actually I'm adding more and more stuff here, but this is very similar, so, or very, very simple. We just want to use a pop color here. And then we can set up whatever we want. We could use an attribute like velocity, you could use whatever. But I want to use a ramp and actually not a ramp. I want to make it random. That's it. And just by the ID. Then I have random color values and I can later on use this in the shader. I will show you this in the next part, how you can render this using Redshift. So this is what we get now. And I think that this is pretty nice. So if we play everything together, merge in these particles as well here, then this should be fine. Yeah, that's pretty good. And it's very similar to the setup that I created for this client project. Now, there's one thing that I want to do, or the last step in this tutorial, in this part of the tutorial, is that I want to prepare everything here for rendering. What I usually like to do is that I separate these things. So you see we have our small lines here, we have this main line here, and we have these particles. So I will put in nulls here and just export them separately. So let's do it like this and rename these. So here I will put in lines, or let's make it out small lines. That makes more sense. Here we make it out main line, and here out particles. And I like to colorize these green, but everybody has his own preferences here. So let's go up one level. And now I just want to create a geometry node for each of these outputs. So I will create a geometry node for the particles. I want to create a geometry node for, and you can also put in something like particles render, for example. Then you know these are rendering something. Then the small trails render, okay. And then we just put in the main trail. And then again, that this is a render. Now we can make these green, that we know these are visible. We can turn this one off, and then we go in here and use object merges and bring in the geometry that we want to link in here. Right here, this will be the out particles. Then in this one here, object merge, this will be the out small lines. And then in this one here, we want to add in an object merge. And we want to point this to our main line. Okay, now you see that I have everything here. And yeah, this is actually where we can proceed to the next part. And this will be how we can render this in Redshift. So thank you very much for watching. Once again, if you want to have the project file and the HDA, then please check out Patreon. Welcome to part 4 of my tutorial series about particle trails in Houdini. In this part, I want to show you how you can render our setup using Redshift. So let's get started. As you can see here, I added the second line into our setup. And if we take a quick look at the line simulation, you see that I also added some explanation here, some comments here. And I just set up the second line that was already in the project before and added more or less exactly the same things as I did here. But I had to tweak a few values, of course, so that this looks nice. But you can go through this if you want. As I said, you can download the whole project file and also the HDA that I created in part number 2 on Patreon. The link is in the video description. Now let's take a look at how we can render this. So to render it, first of all, I want to split my pane top bottom because down here I want to put in my Redshift render view. So let's activate this. And if I activate the render view, right now you see that only my main lines are visible here because these are the only thing that are actually geometry here. The main lines, let me remind you, are path deformed lines that I swept with a sweep node. So these are actual geometry. The other elements are particles and lines. So these are not visible by default. Let me turn off these things here. So let's take a look how we can make these visible. First of all, we can go to our small lines here and go to the Redshift object tab here. And under strands, you can then say render object as strand. As soon as you turn this on, you can choose whether it should be a box, then it is, a box is wrapped around our lines. You can choose a cylinder, then they are round. You can use what's also cool, a strip. Then they are these flat strips. But in my case, I want to use a cylinder because this gives the best result, I think. Then, of course, you have this multiplier, this global scale multiplier. I don't know what is the standard value. Yeah, the standard value is 1, which is, of course, way too thick. So let's set this down to 0.01, I think I had. No, that's too thin. 0.1. Yeah, that looks quite nice. You can play with this value on your own. Maybe set it down a tiny bit, you know, that they are bit thinner. Yeah, that looks good. And this way Redshift knows how to treat these lines. Now on the particles, we have to do something very similar. We have to go to the particles tab under Redshift object and say render objects as particles. And as soon as we do that, let's activate this. You see now they are visible here. And again, you have a global scale modifier that you can, or multiplier that you can set up. Now it is time to create some materials. So let's go in here and let's create a material network. I prefer to do this right here in my object context instead of changing or moving to this material network here. It really doesn't matter where you create a material network in Houdini. You can do it nearly everywhere. So let's dive into this and let's create an RS material builder because, as I said, I'm using Redshift to render this. So now let's create our first material, and this will be my main lines material. And let's dive inside our container here. I do not want to use the standard material. I could use the standard material. There is actually an emission option here, But there is also this RS incandescent shader. And this is actually made for emissive materials. So I will use this. I prefer this one here. And we just have to link this up to the surface here. And now let's apply this material before I do anything else here. So let's go to my main lines, and under render, I will just choose this material here and apply it. If I refresh my viewport, you see nothing changed because I didn't make any changes to the material. But if we come in now in here and change the color, then you see this will update. So let's choose a bluish purple here, maybe something like that. That could look quite nice. Okay. And for now, let's leave this as it is. So just the standard values. Now let's duplicate this one and call it my small lines. And let's also apply this material to my small lines geometry node. And that's also a reason why I like to separate these streams in the simulation and put them into these separate geometry nodes here, because then it's a bit easier to assign materials. And yeah, I can turn off certain elements here individually. It's just a little bit easier and better to work with. Now let's use the small lines here. And if we activate this now, you see these are also purple. But now I want to use the color information that I actually created by assigning this curve view attribute here. And let me remind you that we did this with this color node here. And we used this ramp over attribute, and we chose curve view here and ramped it from black to white. And I only use black to white to remap it now inside my shader. So I go in here and I put in now an RS point attribute first of all, because this will read out the information of our color diffuse value. If I put this straight into the color, then you will see that, yeah, you see nothing anymore, because now they are mapping from black to white, which is not really cool. But we can, of course, remap that. So let's choose a ramp here and remap these colors. So let's create some more interesting colors. The first color will be maybe a reddish pink here, something like that. Okay, then let's add in a second one. And here I want to move through to this purple here, maybe a little bit less saturated. Yeah, something like that. That could be cool. And down here I can go to something like, let's see, maybe turquoise or whatever. Something like that. And if we scroll through this now, let's see which colors we get. Yeah, that looks actually pretty nice. So this could be cool. So let's maybe decrease the saturation on this one a tiny bit. Yeah, that's nice. Another thing that we can do on the incandescent shader is to lower the alpha. And I want to do this here. So I want these to be a little bit transparent, because then they will blend in a little bit nicer. For now, this doesn't look spectacular, as you can see, but I will show you a few tricks later on in Redshift, how you can make this really cool. So now with this setup, we can just duplicate this material and use exactly the same setup for my particles. Because if you remember, I assigned random colors to my particles, and I used a pop color node to do that. And I can use exactly the same setup to read out this color diffuse attribute from the particles and remap it with this ramp. So let's try that out. And let's move up here, go to the particles, and under the render tab, assign this material, the particles material. And let's refresh this. And now you see we have all these particles, and they have a lot of blue because my ramp is now, yeah, there's a lot of blue in there. So I can shift this maybe a bit. I move the purple a bit over. That's quite nice. And also what I could do maybe here in the end, I want to have some brighter ones. So let's bring another color in here, and let's just remove the saturation here, make it really bright so that we get some very bright particles in here, maybe a few more. Let's remap this a little bit, something like that. Okay. So let's take a look what we have here. And you see that right now it really looks pretty boring. So we should definitely add some post effects here, because these make it way cooler. So let's take a look at these post effects options that we have. And one of the most important ones in this case is, of course, the depth of field. And if we take a look at the settings here, if you are familiar with the old Redshift versions, I think right now I am on Redshift. Let me quickly take a look. Version 3.5.14. And in the older versions, there was a separate tab here for the bokeh. Now this is all included under optical here, and that's why I want to show you this again. I know that I used these post effects in other tutorials already, but some things changed, and so I wanted to show the new settings a little bit. I didn't work through everything, and I don't know exactly what they changed, but I found out a few things. So first of all, what I definitely want to do is add more exposure, because this works quite nice with the bloom that I want to add later. So let's set it to 1.5 for now. Exposure plus 1.5. Now I want to change the aperture here. And if I go lower and lower with this aperture to a really low value, now you see we get this very extreme depth of field here, or this blurriness here. That's of course way too much. But in this case, I actually like it if it is a bit artificial and a bit too much. So let's take a look how this looks like. Yeah, it actually looks really cool because these particles look very nice when they are blurred. And then we can add some bloom. So let's go to the bloom tab here and let's lower the threshold until we start seeing something. And you see we have to lower it quite a bit to 0 actually to see anything here. And this has to do, on the one hand, you can change this with the exposure, as you can see here. But on the other hand, you can also change it in the material. So if we go to the small lines, for example, and here we have this intensity multiplier on our illumination, and if I set this to 3, you see that these now glow way brighter. So this is actually way too much. So let's set this back to 2. And I can also change the alpha, and yeah, this will also change the look of these. If I set it to 0.5, for example, they will blend into each other a bit more and will become a little bit less bright. So that's a good option. Then we can also do this on the main line, and here we could go higher with the intensity multiplier. If we set this to 3, then this line will glow way more. And let me do one more thing. I just want to take a color that is a little bit more outside of the colors of our small lines, because then it will be a bit more obvious that this is something else here. Maybe we do this really bluish tint here. Yeah, that looks actually quite nice. And now let's take a look on the particles, and want to set this also to 2, because then these become also way brighter. And you see right now the bloom is too strong. So let's go to the bloom settings, and now we can just reduce this threshold. But you see now it's responding way nicer, and we can really bring something in that's cool. And I don't want to overdo it with the bloom, you know. This is no bloom, so just a tiny bit, most of the time, is enough. And I think that this is already a very nice style. So if you take a look at that, that's really cool. And sometimes I really like to do that directly in Redshift and render it out just on a black plate. And then if you want to composite it, you can use the screen mode. I had some problems with this. I can render it out, of course, with a black background, but I had huge problems rendering it out with an alpha channel because this just didn't work. And then you have a big problem with this depth of field things, and applying depth of field in post-production with these small lines, especially in After Effects, is nearly impossible. So what I usually really do is I set this up here, and because these render quite fast, so if I activate this render, the bucket rendering, you will see how fast this is. And I'm rendering now only with one graphics card. So one of the 3090s is active and the other one is recording, or my 2080 is recording. And you see it only took 10 seconds. And that's really fast. And you can even bring this down. If you use denoising, you can bring this down to a few seconds. So let's take a look at that quickly, because that's quite interesting to know. Let's go to my output context. Let's turn it off for a moment. And let's go to the render settings of Redshift. And if we take a look here, now the threshold is quite low. So in this case, you do not need this. You can really render this with 0.1, turn on denoising, and that's it. You know, now you're good to go. And let's take a look how fast this will render now. So if we render these settings, it will rush through, you know. We get even faster renders, and if you have multiple GPUs, then it will be really, really fast, and the quality is good, you know. If you take a look here, the denoising is doing a good job. Of course, it's not that nice anymore. We lose some details here, but it really doesn't make a big difference. And yeah, okay, the render times are not that much lower now anyway, so 10 seconds. But 10 seconds per frame in this resolution is really cool, I think. So this is really great for creating motion graphics. Good, so this is it with this tutorial. I hope that you learned some tips and tricks, and actually it was a tutorial series. If you like my teaching style, then please check out Patreon. There I have some exclusive tutorials, and of course you can get all the project files and the HDA of this tutorial. So thank you very much for all of your support, and I hope to see you soon. Goodbye.